Good afternoon, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to welcome on your behalf Archbishop Mark Coleridge to this meeting. He can certainly speak with authority about what it's like to live in historic Wynberg, having been its resident for the last 13 years. The house provokes enormous curiosity. How many times have I been asked, do you know anything about that lovely big house behind the stone fence near the top of Brunswick Street? Needless to say, it's always a favourite stop on our walks around the heart of New Farm. And of course, on the day, if the Archbishop is free, he's always willing to meet the group. Archbishop Coleridge was born in Melbourne and was ordained a priest there in 1974. He served in various parishes before studying scripture at the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome. Back in Melbourne, he taught scripture, where he was eventually made Master of the Catholic Theological College. In late 1997, he was appointed to work in Rome at the Secretary of State at the Holy See, and then fast forward to 2002 when he was ordained Auxiliary Bishop of Melbourne, and then 4 years later named Archbishop of Canberra and Goulburn. In 2012, he succeeded John Bathersby as the 7th Archbishop of Brisbane. And during that period, between 2018 and 2022, he served as President of the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference. So without further ado, I invite you to offer a very warm welcome to Archbishop Mark Coleridge.
Thank you very much indeed, Jared, for the introduction. And also thank you to whoever issued the invitation. Was it you, Desley? I thought so. To tell you the truth, when I accepted this invitation, and I say no to many, I had no idea I was going to be speaking to a throng like this. I honestly thought I'd be coming to speak to perhaps, 20 or 30 people. But I standing here in front of you, I feel as if I'm speaking at the Gabba. Now, I'm recovering from sinusitis, so if I sound a little croaky and have to blow my nose occasionally, that's why. I'm on antibiotics and off the grog, so I'm sharper than ever in some ways, but not quite at my best. Now, I am on the verge of retirement. I may not look it. But in the church that I serve, it is law that a bishop, when he turns 75, must, note, submit his resignation to the Pope, who then, it's not just the Pope, of course, it's his team of advisors, who then decide when the resignation should be accepted and who should succeed to the see. So I am awaiting the appointment of my successor, the next Catholic Archbishop of Brisbane, and then I shall, once he's installed, I shall ride off into the sunset. And one of the things I will miss, and there's a great deal I'll miss about the Episcopal ministry, there's much that I won't miss, but there are some things that I will miss, certainly. Because these 13 years in Brisbane, I have to say, have been the richest and most satisfying years of my life. I've had an extraordinary life. I've been a priest for 51 years. And when I was ordained on a cold May day in 1974, I had no idea what I was in for. I signed a blank cheque, but it's turned out much better than anything I could ever have planned for myself. I never imagined that I would end up the Archbishop of Brisbane. John Bathersby, in fact, was a great mate of mine in our student days in Rome. And in those days, the early 80s, no one would have imagined that John Bathersby would end up the Archbishop of Brisbane, and even fewer would have thought that I would end up his successor. But that's the way it's fallen, and it's been a great blessing for me. But one of the things I will certainly miss as I go to my retirement cottage in Ormiston is Wynberg. So in a sense, I accepted this invitation to pay a tribute to the house, which is not my house. But I have been privileged to live in the house, in one of the great houses of the city, for a number of years. When I say it's not my house, it really is a house that belongs to the Catholic people of Brisbane. They paid for it back in 1925. We're celebrating the centenary, at least of our presence, in this old house. But they paid for the house back in 1925. Archbishop Dewey was great at spending other people's money. And they continue to pay for it. And it's not a cheap product. A big old house does cost money to maintain. And the house is well maintained now. I'll come to that in a minute. But let me give you some of the backstory. Back in the 1890s, the Catholic Archbishop of Brisbane was a man called Robert Dunn. Now, Robert Dunn succeeded James Quinn. They fought furiously, but Dunn succeeded him. They were Irish, of course. And initially, Dunn lived in the house that Quinn had lived in, called Dara, D-A-R-A, and it was on that hill just opposite All Hallows School. And it was a fairly simple place. So when Archbishop Dunn went to Europe, and in those days when they went to Europe, they went for about 6 months. We go for about 6 days. So when he went on one of these extended tours of Europe, the wealthy Catholics of Brisbane, the Mains and so on, got together and they demolished, this was with no reference to the Archbishop, usual story, they demolished the old Dara. I think they just had to push it down really. And they built this splendid new residence, the new Dara. And when Dunn came back from Europe, he found this wonderful new home. And that's where he lived until he eventually was succeeded by Archbishop James Dewey. Now, Dewey had become what's called the coadjutor archbishop in 1912. He had been a priest in Ipswich, and then at a very young age he was made the Bishop of Rockhampton. And then still at a young age, only in his early 40s, he was made the coadjutor archbishop, which means you're waiting in the wings. He's the sort of assistant bishop, but he has the right of succession. He will be the next archbishop. One of the problems for Dewey, however, was that Dunn kept keeping on. Just wouldn't die. But the other thing that Dewey absolutely hated was Dunn wouldn't give him the chequebook. Because Dunn in his last years was very frail and very inactive, by which I mean he did nothing. And this was a time when the Catholic community was growing at a great rate. And Dewey is this young, energetic archbishop. He could see the need, but he didn't have the chequebook. As a result, when Dunn finally died in 1917 and Dewey became the archbishop, you know what he got? The chequebook. So Dewey went berserk, and that's why in recent years I've been running all over the Archdiocese of Brisbane, which is a big patch of turf, celebrating centenaries. Parishes, schools, you name it, Dewey built it, usually on a hill. Now, his great obsession, however, was a new cathedral. St Stephen's was there, but for Dewey it wasn't quite grand enough to match his sense of, well, the grandeur of the Catholic Church, I guess, and the grandeur of his own episcopal status, I guess. So he was determined to build what became Holy Name Cathedral, and he decided that the best place for it was the site of Archbishop's house, the new Dara. So what did he do? He demolished this grand old house that had stood for not that many years. And as a result, the wealthy Catholics of Brisbane never forgave him. And that's one of the reasons he never raised the money for the new cathedral. He had the plans drawn up, and they're available. They're fascinating. He was going to build this enormous Roman basilica. In other words, do something different from Sydney and Melbourne, which had the grandeurs of William Waddell's neo-Gothic. He was going to build a Roman basilica, you know, with a big dome and to seat, wait for it, 4,000 people. Just imagine. Anyway, the foundation stone was laid, as you may know, and the crypt was built and used for worship. But the cathedral was never built. Dewey kept investing money in crazy schemes to try and make the money that he required to build the cathedral, but it never happened. Now, once he demolished Dara, he needed somewhere else to live. Now, with his eye for real estate, he surveyed the scene, and his eye fell upon a house in Hamilton called Eldonell. Might ring a bell for some of you. But Eldonell wasn't for sale, so he had to cool his heels. Now, he moved into Wynberg as a temporary residence. The church bought the house in 1925, as I have said. Dewey had been pestering Mrs. Wilcox, the wife of George Wilcox, who had built the place in the 1880s, wanting to buy it from the Wilcox family. I think George Wilcox, again, there are some of you who may know the history of this better than I. George Wilcox, I think, died in the 1890s, but his wife and family lived on in Wynberg. But Dewey was dead keen to buy Wynberg as a temporary residence, and then he was going to give the place to nuns to run a hospital, in the days when hospitals were just a big old house with a few beds. Remember those days? So, and then he wanted to buy and move into the still grander residence on the hill in Hamilton, Eldersell. Now, eventually he missed out on the place in Hamilton, which eventually became the Anglican Archbishop's house in 1964. Horror of horrors. Thank God Dewey was dead. And because he missed out on the big place in Hamilton and the Anglican Archbishop got it, mind you, Philip Aspinall sold it, that's why I'm living at Wynberg still and standing here before you talking about the place. Now, all I can say is thank God for two things: that Dewey never built that cathedral, Holy Name. It would have been a huge millstone around our neck. Just there, opposite the front gate of All Hallows, where you see, it's a shocking complex called Cathedral Village. That whole property there was where this enormous cathedral was going to be. Thank God that never happened. And also, I have to say, thank God we didn't get the place in Hamilton. Because frankly, I would much rather live in New Farm. Which, just as an aside, I would say is one of the most interesting parts of the city. And there are many interesting parts of Brisbane. I can say too, more generally, that as one who came from elsewhere, you heard that I'm a Melburnian by birth. Though I did my primary schooling in Adelaide and I was in 13 years in Rome as a student and as a worker, and then 6 years in Canberra and so on. So I've been all over the place. But I have to say Brisbane suits me very well. People have said, are you going back to Melbourne in retirement? I said, no, Melbourne's not home for me anymore, Brisbane is. And as a part of Brisbane, I find it hard to beat New Farm. Close to the river, close to the city, the look of the place. It also intrigues me that New Farm for many, many years, and some of you will remember these years, was really struggle town, where there are a lot of poor Italian people who live there in properties now worth an absolute fortune, working down on the wharves, I think, or in the warehouses there on the river. But in the meantime, New Farm has undergone an extraordinary transformation. And it is posh without seeming too posh. I'm not made for too posh, and I don't think it's appropriate either that a bishop should be living, in a posh house in a posh part of town. But the purchase of Wynberg went back to the days when bishops, generally, not just Catholic bishops, did live in the big house and drove the big car. I mean, it was all symbolic stuff, but they were other times. And It was significant, for instance, that Pope Francis abandoned the black Mercedes-Benz with the papal flag fluttering on the front and was driven around in a Ford Focus. And I noticed Pope Leo's getting around in a Volkswagen. How low can you go? So, I mean, it's all changed, but in the midst of it all, one thing that hasn't changed is Wynberg. Now, when Dewey bought the place, he decided to make it not only his residence, but his office. And that was not uncommon. And in fact, it remained the Archbishop's office with his staff, his secretaries and so on, until I came. The only one of the archbishops who didn't live in Wynberg was Patrick O'Donnell, who for 18 years had been the coadjutor to Dewey, because he was appointed when everyone thought that Dewey was about to fall off his perch. But Dewey lasted even longer than Dunn. He died at the age of, 95, I think, having been the archbishop for 50 years. And if you'd asked Dewey how to spell retirement, he would have said D-E-A-T-H. They didn't know what retirement was. Mannix was the same in Melbourne. Mannix died at 99 and was still the archbishop. And in his last interview that he ever gave at the age of 99 with Gerald Lyons, you might remember him, on the ABC, and Lyons said to him at the end, "Well, Your Grace, thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure to interview you at this stage of your life, and I very much hope we can do the same next year." And Mannix just looked at him and said, "I don't see why not. You look well enough." That was the last thing he said publicly, because he died not long after. Never made it to 100. Now, Wynberg then becomes the Archbishop's residence, the Archbishop's office, and the residence of the cathedral clergy. Now, that's unusual, because normally in our arrangement, the Archbishop has his own house, he has an office somewhere else, normally near the cathedral, and then the cathedral clergy live somewhere else. So to have the three together in this one big house was very unusual. Now, I came there in 2012, and I thought, well, I'll give it a go. I mean, it's not what I'm used to. Mind you, I do like a bit of company in the house. I'm not made for life on my own. I can do it, but the only time in my now long life that I have actually lived on my own were the 4 years I had as the Auxiliary Bishop of Melbourne. For the rest of my 76 years, I have always had company in the house, and temperamentally, that suits me well. To have the cathedral clergy with me here at Wynberg is good. I have the Dean, Father Anthony Mellor, and the Associate Pastor, Father Michael Tran. And we work well. I mean, we don't, we go past like ships in the night in some ways, but we pray together in the morning, we eat together from time to time, and there's a good sense of a bond in the ministry, and that again is a real help to me. Now, the problem for me was that the situation that I struck in the office at Wynberg was quite dysfunctional. It may have suited Archbishop Bathersby. It certainly didn't suit me. So I took the big decision after about 6 months of giving it a go. I took the big decision to move the office into the cathedral. So I moved my own office out of the front study, as I now call it. If you've been in Wynberg, it's that first room on the right. It's a lovely room. I put in bookshelves because I have heaps of books, having been an academic before I was a bishop. And so it became a private library, but it's also a place where I can see people in comparative privacy, because not everyone wants to come into the office at the cathedral. So I do see people there occasionally, but for the most part, it's a place where I read, where I write. If I have to do any serious writing, and I am a bit of a writer, so I have a lot of writing to do, and I tend to do it at the house because there are fewer distractions. Now, then moving the secretaries out was a fate worse than death, but anyway, we did. So we all moved out of the house. We turned where the secretaries were, which was the big area next to the Archbishop's office. Again, it's a bit confusing if you don't know the house, but And having moved them out of there, we found the whole place was in a mess. So we converted that large space, we returned it to what it had been. In other words, a sitting room. Oh, there's the house. Now, I didn't realise that was... I'll point out, one thing I'll point out immediately is the marble fountain, which was a gift of the Italian community to Duig in 1937, and it is a replica of the Verrocchio fountain in the cortile, the courtyard of the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. And it has been vandalised, but we put it back together again, like Humpty, unlike Humpty rather. But I'll come back particularly to the work that was done on the house at the top, which is one of the unpleasant aspects of the house, it seems to me. Now, we converted the secretary's area into a place where the public could be received, because the house didn't have an area other than the clergy common room where we could have people in. Now, my understanding of the role is that I do have people into the house. So that in general terms, when I moved the office out, I had the people in. So we now have wonderful spaces, and some of you who have been there have seen these, what we call the blue room, this sitting room, which has a small dining area as well. And then it opens out onto, my favourite part of the house is the terrace, overlooking the garden. Now, it was hardly used until I came, but I absolutely love it. That will be one of the things I will really miss. And we dine out on the terrace or the veranda as often as we can. And in Brisbane, that means you dine there often. So it's a gem. But you can have indoor, outdoor, and you have 50 or 60 people for a reception or whatever. And it works extremely well. You put the bar on the veranda, not inside, and but people could mingle inside. Then the veranda also issues onto what's called the gold room, no? The gold room is no longer gold, it's blue. It had a facelift before my time, but it's still called the gold room. Welcome to the church. We change slowly. It's like the diocese of Bendigo, we still call Sandhurst, which was the original name of Bendigo. The gold room was the large and very splendid room that Wilcox built for his two daughters. He wanted them to be leading lights of high society in Brisbane. Can you imagine high society in Brisbane in the 1880s? But anyway, it's a beautiful room, and Dewey used it almost as a kind of throne room. He would receive people there, and these were the days when people used to call on the Archbishop. Well, it's not quite like that now. But Dewey would have piles of books and newspapers, and it was like walking through a labyrinth to get to him at the other end of the gold room. But Dewey had studied many years in Rome, and he had a great sense of what they call Romanità. He loved things Roman. So, for instance, we have a bust of Caesar Augustus, the first of the Roman emperors. When I got to the house, Caesar Augustus was the first thing you saw when you walked into the house, into the foyer. And I thought, well, this is not the look for people to walk into the Archbishop's house and the first thing they see is a Roman emperor. So I moved him further down into the house. But into this gold room, Dewey bought from one of the princely families of Rome, have a palazzo in Rome, the Palazzo Colonna. They must have had a garage sale or something. But there are a lot of gold fittings and furnishings that filled the room. So it was a rather grand room. So the gold room issues onto the veranda, and then at the other end of the veranda it issues into the blue room. So again, to have the people in, it works brilliantly, I have to say. Now, what I say to people, and some of you may have been there and heard me say this, it is not my house. Sometimes people thank me for welcoming them to my own house. No, it's not my house. It's their house as much as mine. Because, as I said earlier, they paid for it and they still pay for it. So it works very well. We now have private sections of the house where the clergy can do their thing, but we have other parts of the house which are clearly public. And now that That separation in a house like Wynberg is very important, and the lines between the public sections and the private sections were blurred. The other thing that I decided to do, and I applaud myself for this, among my many mistakes, but I decided that the house was dysfunctional in certain ways, partly because no one knew who was in charge. Everyone thought they were in charge. So even if you wanted to change a light bulb, you didn't know who to go to. So, the light bulb never got changed. So it was quite shambolic, I have to say, at least in my judgment. Others who'd lived there before me seemed to think it worked all right. Well, I didn't. And I thought to myself, and I said to others, the house like this, and the complex operation that it is, it needs a house manager. So that's when I decided to employ a house manager, and we were very lucky to get one as excellent as Leanne Adams, who has been, Gerard, you've met Leanne, and some of you might have met her as well. She has been absolutely wonderful. She's been there, I think, about 12 years. If I've been there 13, she came not long after me. And she also managed to employ a wonderful chef. Now, it sounds very grand, chef, but he only worked 3 days a week, Tuesdays, Thursdays and Sundays, and then left food for the other days. But Pierre-Antoine, he was French, still is. He was a gem. So the combination of Leanne Adams as house manager and Pierre-Antoine as the chef was very, very successful. When I say he was great, I mean he could do finger food, canapé for receptions. He could do a formal dinner for a dozen in the wonderful formal dining room, which we hardly ever use. But he could cook that. He could cook a meal for 3 clergy just on a Tuesday or Thursday evening or Sunday at lunch. His versatility knew no end, and the variety of stuff that he could present. At the same time, I and others like Leanne have been very keen to say Wynberg is not a reception facility. People want to use it in that, but we're not. We're good, but we're not that good or good in that particular way. It's not a reception facility, but we do have people in. Now, once Pierre-Antoine decided to move out after 9 years and to move up towards Rockhampton, we struggled to find anyone even remotely as competent. But we now have one of the best chefs in Brisbane, although he's injured at the moment, unfortunately. Shannon Kellam, who ran Montrachet for quite some years and is very well known in culinary circles in Brisbane. Now, he only works part-time for us. He does other things, consults to restaurants and does all kinds of things. But he, again, is a wonderful presence in the house. The thing about Wynberg, I guess, is that it's not just a building. Occasionally people have said to me, it should be bulldozed, or why don't we sell it? Well, I've said to them, on my watch at least, and it's about to expire, we are not going to sell Wynberg. We're going to do what we can to maintain it, and we have maintained it very well. One of the difficulties, I might just add as an aside, is dealing with the Heritage Council, because everything, at least on the outside of Wynberg, is heritage listed. Now that can't, Vicky, listening? Yes, I'll give you one example. The front fence. Now, have you noticed how splendid it is? Yes. Well, it was a shambles, and we all knew that. The sandstone had deteriorated dramatically, and it was becoming even a bit dangerous. So we decided that we had to do something, but then we were told by the Heritage Council we had to restore it exactly as it was, which meant getting the same stone from the same quarry, and this was going to cost $500,000. Now, we're not broke, but we're not rich. And I said, and I meant it, I said, if we are forced to do this, to spend that order of money on a fence that is basically ornamental, I will sell Wynberg. I kind of half meant it. But as it turned out, very sensibly, a compromise was reached, and for about half that sum, it's still a lot of money for an ornamental fence, we managed to produce a fence which looks fine and is very secure. So that's worked out very well. If George Wilcox walked into Wynberg today, the man who built it, just by the way, the name of the house, you may know the story. Wilcox had made a lot of money in he was English, had made a lot of money in South Africa, largely building railways in and around Cape Town. And one of his favourite places near Cape Town, it was then a town outside the city where there were vineyards, was Wynberg, which is Dutch or Afrikaans for vineyard. And when he came to Brisbane and built this house on a much larger property, of course, he decided to name it after his favourite place near Cape Town and called it Wynberg. So there's the South African connection. And if you listen to or watch the cricket from Cape Town, Newlands, you will see or hear the commentator saying, he's bowling from the Wynberg end. Because what was a town outside the city is now a suburb of the city. So he's bowling from the Wynberg end. Even when we had to remove a tree from the garden, because the garden's all listed too, a lot of the garden, again, George Wilcox would recognise immediately. It has changed, obviously, but it hasn't changed dramatically. Some of those trees are quite original plantings. Now, one of them, and trees have a life like us, had to be removed. Well, it was the greatest rigmarole. Neighbours were up in arms and were going to storm Wynberg, and so again, the council kicked it. Thank you, Vicky. And eventually, at the cost of, I think, about 10 grand,
you were very well behaved.
we tried to be, Vicky. No, well, we at great cost, we eventually removed the tree, and I must say, when I looked, it looked like a mouth that had just lost a tooth. You thought, oh dear, did we have to? So, and we've got the same challenge looming. There's an enormous old jacaranda tree on the other side of the garden, which is at the end of its life and is dropping boughs and all that sort of thing. So we're going to have to do something with it. But we've learned from the last time we'll do it properly. But that is one of the challenges. Now, before we had heritage councils, certain things were done to the house which I think were badly mistaken. The prime one is that top part. Now that used to be, what do they call these things? It was an open terrace, a roof terrace with, what do they call it? Widow's Walk. I have never heard that before. I should come here more often. Well, thank you, Jared. There was a widow's walk where they could sit out at night. It had a kind of a roof, I think, and potted palms and things. But eventually, this was again in Dewey's time, they needed more accommodation because at its peak, I think something like 7 or 8 clergy lived in the place. God only knows where. So that was all enclosed in very ugly, I have to say, every time I look at it I feel offended, ugly fibro. And again, if I'd had the guts or whatever, I would have ripped it all down, and because now you see we don't need the extra accommodation. But there were clergy living everywhere, even out on the veranda. But then Dewey decided to build the tower, which looks a little pompous, I think. We don't raise the flag every morning and salute. Or someone suggested I should have the Archbishop's flag, like the Queen when she's at the King, I beg your pardon, at Buckingham Palace. The standard is up. Well, no, we won't be going down that path. But really the tower it's not even ornamental because it's largely hidden behind this excrescence. The other thing you can't see so well is this addition here. It's a one-storey apartment and again a fairly ordinary addition. The reason it was built was because Dewey couldn't manage the stairs. Now, therefore, they in his last years, they built him this apartment just off the office, so it was like living on the job. And Archbishop Rush lived in it, Archbishop Battersby lived in it. I walked in, I'd never seen the place before, when I was appointed, took one look at it and said, no way, is there another option? And then they took me upstairs to where Dewey had lived for years, to the room where it's a lovely, it's just a big studio, it's one room, and it's a lovely space. And I can manage the stairs, just in case you're wondering. So those two additions are not great at all and don't do justice to the house. But the rest of it is pretty well as it would have been in Wilcox's time. What is now the clergy common room out here on the ground floor used to be the billiard room, you know, when they'd have dinner in the formal dining room and the ladies would retire to the sitting room and the gentlemen would go off to play billiards and smoke cigars and drink port and stuff. It's a lovely room. The other thing I should say is, and it's not obvious in this photograph, but the windows of Wynberg are one of its glorious features. They're slightly mysterious. No one can quite identify the style. There looks to be a touch of Art Nouveau, but it's not Art Nouveau. Where did the glass come from? Even the experts don't know. And we have had, you know, glass experts in, and they've done tracings of the windows in case there's breakage. And we've had protective screens put in to protect the glass because the experts have said if there were breakage, you couldn't replace this glass. That it's, but they are, if you ever get the chance to pop in, no, and we do have groups in occasionally when, what's that thing called, the open house? Or yeah, we have it once or twice. Can't disturb the Archbishop. But we have had groups in, but the glass and the woodwork is extraordinary, given that most of it seems to have been done locally. Although when I look at the glass, I think it must have been imported from Europe. But the woodwork, the panelling and the banisters, balustrades of the staircase are really just wonderful. Now, what you need to understand is that the public rooms of the house are quite grand. The ones that I have mentioned, the blue room, which is the sitting room, the dining room, the gold room, and people tend to think that that's the way the whole house is. Well, that's not true. The accommodation for myself and the clergy is, I won't say it's ordinary, but it's not flash. It's at about the level that you would find in any Catholic presbytery, but which for us is a priest's house, that you'd find in any parish. So there is a difference, and this is typical of Europe in some ways, that the private quarters are quite simple, the public spaces are quite grand. And that's absolutely true of Wynberg. See, it works very well with myself and two priests living there, because each man has his own space. I'm upstairs at the end of the balcony. Father Michael is up in the tower, rather grandly, and the Dean, Father Anthony, is just off the priest's common room. He's on the ground level. So you're not kind of living on top of one another. And that works well. You've got the spaces where you can come together, but you have your own space as well. And I can tell you from experience that any religious house, to work well, needs the right interaction of public and private space. Probably any human dwelling does as well. Have there been downsides to living at Wynberg? Not many. I like going to work and not living on the job and coming home, even if I bring a bag of work with me. Psychological distance helps me. Having to deal with the Heritage Council can be a hassle, as I've suggested. The other thing is, particularly now that there's that wonderful sign out the front where people often stop, and if the gates are open, which they often are, if Leanne's in the house, people walk in. They think it's public property, and I don't blame them. And I mean, I don't sort of turn the hose on them or anything. But occasionally you've just got to say, no, you do realise this is, a private house? Oh, really? Or there were some young people who knocked on the front door. It was a Saturday morning, in fact. I remember I was working in the front study and I could see them coming through the gate. So the doorbell rang and I was dressed casually. And I opened they were collecting money. I opened the door and they said, "Oh, hello." I said, "Oh, hello." And they said, "Is this a museum?" I said, "No, I might look like it, but I'm the Archbishop." "Oh, for real?" So, I mean, it's not a hassle. It's just a fact of life. But there are very, very few downsides to living in Wynberg. The other thing, just by the way, we use it for is guest accommodation. We have a procession of people from all around the world staying there. And so I've wanted it to be a house that's renowned for its hospitality, which I think is one of the greatest of all Christian virtues. St. Benedict would agree with me. And I think it has been that. Now, what will happen with my successor? Don't ask me. He can do whatever he likes, and he will. When I think of my time in Canberra, because we had a supercell storm at one stage in Canberra that knocked down 3 jerry-built additions to Archbishop's House in Canberra, the only private residence in the parliamentary circle, I spent a great deal of money on renovating Archbishop's House, which it desperately needed. It was ramshackle, to put it mildly. And then I came to Brisbane and my successor in Canberra decided not to live in Archbishop's House. Went to live in an apartment over in Kingston. It's his call. I doubt very much that will happen here in Brisbane. And I very much hope it doesn't, because, as I say, it's not just a building you're inhabiting. It is a story. It's the last of the great episcopal residences, at least in the Catholic Church. They were standard: Raheen in Melbourne, Ennis in Adelaide, Swifts in Sydney, Wynberg here. And I'm rather proud of that, actually. And I enjoy inhabiting a space where there's a sense of layered history and entering a story that's not just my story. It's one of the reasons I've always liked living in Rome. You live in a cultural world that is multi-layered, intensely so, of course, in a place like Rome. But there's a touch of that in Wynberg, and it's not common in Australia. So that sense that, every time I walk down the hallway, there are the pictures of the portraits of my predecessors. So I'll be on the wall soon enough. So I very much hope that my successor will guard Wynberg, because, as this afternoon shows, it's not just for the Archbishop or the cathedral clergy, nor even for the Catholic community. It is, in a sense, a possession of Brisbane. And that's why I was quite happy to accept this invitation to speak to you a little about the experience of being at Wynberg, because it isn't just my place or our place in a narrow sense, it is in a real sense your place as well. So thank you very, very much.